Story 1. My little sister, a toddler at the time, needed to have a small surgery. While they were checking in with the doctor, she played with toys. During a pause in the adults' conversation, they heard my sister have one doll say to the other, "This is my dad. He hits me all the time. My dad did not hit us." The doctor had to ask a few very awkward questions to resolve the situation. Story 2. I had an uncle who bought me silk underwear for my 16th birthday, and when I opened it, he said, "You should try it on right now." Story 3. My grandpa asked me if I was going to breastfeed when I was pregnant. I said I was absolutely going to try. He then gave one of my breasts a little jiggle and said, "With these little things? Good luck." I was left in shock. Story 4. My grandfather cared for his disabled daughter after she was hit by a drunk driver at 21. When he was very old, he mentioned that he deserved some sort of recognition for never abusing her. Excuse me, what? Story 5. When my cousin was 14, my uncle, her father, said her first boyfriend would be very lucky to have her as a girlfriend. I agreed, stating that she was becoming a wonderful young woman. My uncle looked me in the eyes and said, "Yeah, but he'd also get a chance with her fantastic figure." Guess which uncle is never going to see my daughter, who is now a teenager. Story 6. When I was 8, I moved to live with my grandma. My mother was under court orders to visit me once a month until I was 13, which is when I decided to stop seeing her completely. During those visits, she would often say, "Let me see your breasts," and she would lift up my shirt. I didn't wear a bra until I was 13 because I was small. She frequently lifted my shirt to check. Story 7. I used to have a recurring dream about an alien abduction while camping. Sometimes I would wake up in a light sweat. Other times, I would jump out of bed and into the corner of the room until I came to my senses. No, I am not an abductee. It's just a bad nightmare. My younger brother used to wake up and come to my room in the middle of the night to sleep there. One night, I woke up from that nightmare, and he was just standing at the edge of my bed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. He looked right through me and said, "They're coming for you too." Then he turned and walked back to his room. I didn't go back to sleep that night. Story 8. My 33-year-old cousin tried to subtly convince me to have a relationship with him the night before his wedding when I was 15. When I was 17, I was at my family reunion and on the phone with my boyfriend when the same cousin grabbed my phone and said, "Why should she go across the street when she can go across the hall?" Story 9. My grandfather asked to see my underwear until I was around 10 years old, starting when I was about 3. It only stopped when I told my mom I didn't want to show him my underwear anymore, and she was shocked. It began because I apparently wasn't wearing underwear at 3 years old, and my grandma made a big deal out of it. As a result, my grandpa took it upon himself to make sure I was wearing underwear whenever I visited him, which was often. My mom confronted him about it. My dad, his son, still does not believe me. Rot in hell, Grandpa. Story 10. When I was 15, my uncle, whom my brother and I often referred to as Uncle Frico, came to visit. I lived outside Atlantic City with my parents at the time, and he wanted to go to the boardwalk to walk around. I went with him. While we were walking, he randomly said, "You know, if I were a young guy like you, I'd walk up to one of these classy ladies and say, 'Excuse me, miss, would you mind if I licked your private parts for a minute?'" I was instantly appalled. I never had those kinds of discussions with anyone in my family, and even more disturbing, all of the girls around us that he was referring to were about my age or younger. I told my mom that I didn't want to hang out with him anymore because he said inappropriate things to me when nobody was around. She initially told me to just let it slide, saying he was just trying to bond with me over guy stuff. Over the following years and into my adulthood, he would regularly say abhorrent things to me anytime we were alone. The last time I saw him while he was visiting my parents, he actually followed me outside when I was leaving to go home, just to tell me about his fetish for licking his girlfriend's armpits. Immediately after I left, I called my mom and told her not to invite me over whenever he was around, and that I was tired of the uncomfortable conversations. I told her in very graphic detail what he said to me, and she finally agreed with me. Not long after that, she cut ties with him as well, though that was for other reasons. Honestly, I could go on all day about the things he has done, like the time he threw the computer my parents bought for him into the ocean because he worried the government was watching him, which immediately told me he was involved in something inappropriate. Story 11. My great uncle called, and I was happy to hear from him as I wasn't feeling great about my life at the time. I was very depressed and ill, and I felt like most of my family had turned their backs on me. A few minutes into the conversation, he tried to initiate inappropriate behavior, saying, "You know you've always wanted this. This is what you're good for." The only time I spoke to him after that was because I was pressured into lying and telling him I forgave him on his deathbed, which I regret. Story 12. My father, who was a sperm donor, told me, "Don't tell anyone about this or I'll put you in a black hole and you'll never see your mother again." This was how he kept me silent about his abuse. He spent 6 years in prison for it after I found the courage to tell my mother. Story 13. My mom would always remind us before big family gatherings, "Don't sit on Uncle Vern's lap. Don't be alone with him either. He has a history." As a kid, I thought that was kind of scary. As an adult with kids, my question is, why was this man invited back? Story 14. My alcoholic uncle at my 12th birthday party said, "You grew up really nice. If we're ever alone, I'll take it as a yes." I had no clue what he meant until I was older. Story 15. One time, my father referred to my vagina as plowed furrow in front of me and my partner. In case you're wondering, no, I don't speak to him anymore. Story 16. I sincerely apologize to everyone for this. I was expecting ghost stories or unusual things that kids say. Story 17. My nephew, who is several years older than me, called me and told me horrific stories of things he was forced to do in Afghanistan. He was clearly drunk and crying. I was 17 and had no idea how to respond as he talked about having to kill a little boy because he was shooting at them, sharing all kinds of horrors of war. It haunted me for years. A couple of years ago, I found out none of it ever happened. He was a paper pusher because he injured his knee playing basketball. Story 18. The first girl I ever brought home when I was 13 and interested in was met by my dad coming home from work. Before I could introduce them, he abruptly asked, "So, have you two had sex yet?" I was mortified. She left. My dad didn't meet another one of my girlfriends until I was in my mid-20s, when my girlfriend and I rented a place together. Story 19. I was going through a divorce and staying with my sister. I was sleeping on the floor in her spare room when I woke up and saw her standing over me with a knife in her hand. She said, "It awakens." I replied, "What? What is going on?" She blinked and turned away. After I locked the room's door, I began to look for a different place to stay and stayed up for the rest of the night. She struggles with paranoid schizophrenia. Story 20. When my son was 3, his mother had to send him to a timeout for some reason. He didn't want to and threw a fit, so I reiterated that he had to go and be by himself until he could behave. He started storming away, then turned, walked close to me, and hissed, "They'll never find you." He's 12 now and he doesn't remember it. But when I told him about it, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, that sounds like something I would say." Story 21. He dresses his wife to resemble his deceased mother, then takes her to swinger parties to watch her with other men. The creepiest part is his discussions about it. Story 22. My uncle is a heroin addict who has disgraced the family multiple times. After my father's birthday party, which usually ran rather late, I woke up at about 7 a.m. and went downstairs to find a few remaining birthday guests. One of them was my uncle. He followed me into the kitchen and handed me a knife, explaining how to wield it without leaving any prints. It had a special ribbed part on the blade that was hard to explain. Then he told me that if I ever got in trouble, I should use it and say my uncle did it. I was 16 or 17 at the time. He also came by the house once after he had become estranged from the family. My father answered the door, and my uncle said he came looking for me, claiming he had followed the sweet wrappers. This did not resonate with me at all, and my father yelled at him. He left. Later, I found out he had gotten wind of the guy I was dating who was dealing drugs. I had no idea until after we broke it off. My uncle tried to get in touch with me to warn me that he knew what I was getting myself into. Creepy as it may seem, in his own way, he tried to look out for me. Story 23. My child looked into the dining room at night, with the light off, and said, "Who's that person with the red eyes?" It really startled me. I kept the lights on for weeks after that. Story 24. When I was 11, I was self-conscious about my chest. My father asked me to show it to him and told me we could do beautiful things together. Story 25. We used to be close once. Can we be close again? As he groped my chest while holding my baby sister. These were the words from my grandfather 10 years later after he assaulted me during my childhood. Story 26. He was my cousin. He found me on Yahoo Messenger and said he was distancing himself from his side of the family. We would chat about once a week. A couple of months in, he invited me to visit. I turned him down because I was broke. He mentioned I could share his bed, and I was taken aback. He then talked about moving to Kentucky, saying he had researched it and that cousins being together was legal. I just responded with disgust and blocked him, then deleted Messenger. I refused to ever attend anything he would be at. Story 27. I was 13. It was summer break, and I had just spilled a glass of milk. I wasn't being moody, and we weren't fighting. It was just an accident. He flew into a rage and screamed at me, "I'm sorry I ever had you for a daughter." He never apologized, and I took him at his word. I went on to believe I was utterly worthless. Statements like these were weekly experiences because he was always quick to anger when he was hungover. Verbal abuse was all I knew until I left home at 18. If he wasn't going after me, he was screaming at my mom, "You're a fat pig," while destroying everything in the living room. I was a straight-A student when this occurred. I'd never been in trouble, never had a boyfriend, and never done drugs. I was the epitome of the Hermione Granger type, and I was like that because I was desperate to matter to him. When you are a child of an alcoholic, you select a role. I was the one who would read the room and adjust everything about my behavior to avoid the alcoholic's anger. My needs had no value and did not matter. I had no value. All that mattered was doing what was necessary to keep the alcoholic happy and myself safe. I'm 41 now, and I have thought about those words every day since he said them. They haunt me like a ghost and define my self-worth, even though it's irrational. When your own father regrets your very existence, everybody else must too. These words are why my father is largely dying alone. Story 28. My half-older brother is about 25 years older than me, and obviously we didn't grow up together. We were never close. However, he once sent me a message to share a fond memory. Apparently, when I was about 3 or 4, I had a dress with matching bloomers to cover my diaper. He said I would laugh and giggle, looking at him while rolling around as if I wanted him to look at my bloomers in that fashion. I blocked him and never looked back. I feel uncomfortable just typing this. Story 29. We adopted a baby from China 20 years ago. When I casually mentioned how much my husband loved her, his uncle said, "Just make sure he doesn't love her too much." This was around the time people were commenting on Woody Allen running off with Mia Farrow's adopted daughter. It was a pretty inappropriate thing to say about a toddler and my husband. Story 30. I got dressed up for a baby shower when I was about 9, and my uncle told me that if I was 40 years older or he was 40 years younger, we would have fun together. I knew what he meant because I grew up feeling awkward and just blushed and walked away. About a year later, I wasn't allowed to visit his house until I was 16, and no other inappropriate comments were ever made. It made me wonder for years why I couldn't go over during that time, but when I got older, I realized he had feelings he disliked about himself and was protecting me from him, as he was the one who said not to come over. Story 31. My sister was discussing when she had to fire one of her associates for making inappropriate comments towards his female coworkers and guests. My stepdad remarked, "Why can't people just keep their mouths shut?" He wasn't addressing the man's behavior. He was genuinely questioning why women no longer tolerate such treatment. Story 32. My poor grandfather has had a couple of strokes and now makes inappropriate comments to me. The most recent being, "I would date you if we were the same age." It makes me sad because he was always a wonderful man and like a father to me. Since he has had the strokes, he is very childlike and inappropriate. This situation deeply saddens me. Story 33. We were all gathered around the dinner table. My 1-year-old daughter was sucking on a corn on the cob when my father commented that she would make a man very happy one day. There was a moment of silence, and I told him to stop sexualizing my infant child. He quit drinking shortly after that, but I still keep an eye on him and ensure he isn't left alone with my children. Story 34. My 3-year-old daughter, wearing a nightgown, was sleepwalking into the middle of the dark playroom and just standing there until I looked up from my chair in an adjacent room. Squinting into the shadows, I asked her what she was doing awake. "Shoo," she whispered, putting her finger to her lips. "Don't wake up the toys." Then she turned around and silently padded off into the darkness, back to her room. Story 35. A friend was staying at my house when we were playing Super Nintendo in the middle of the night. My mom came down the stairs and asked, "Why are there Nintendo characters running around on top of the fridge?" She looked genuinely mortified. She had a cold and hadn't dosed her cough syrup, which made her quite disoriented. Story 36. Way back when my 3-year-old looked up from playing and kindly informed me that the puppet master controls all the dead children, then went back to their game. I was later told by my older kids that it was related to Five Nights at Freddy's, which eased my mind slightly. Story 37. My stepbrother and his wife were visiting my biological father and stepmother while I was temporarily living with them. Their baby wasn't too happy about being in a strange place with strangers, but somehow the child and I hit it off. I would often wake up when they asked me to take care of him during the night when he was fussy. I adored it. My biological father was helping me babysit when suddenly his mood changed. He looked down at the baby and roughly pushed him over. I managed to grab the baby before he fell off the bed. Meanwhile, my biological father chuckled and said, "What are his parents going to do about it? They are staying in my home and financially dependent on me." He then pretended to smack the baby in my arms and walked away. I left a few weeks later and haven't spoken to him in over 30 years. Story 38. My older sister is about 10 years older than me. Her husband was about 5 years older than she was, making him around 15 years older than me. He felt more like an uncle. He was driving me to high school when I was about 15. There was a friend of mine on some steps leading up to the school. She was dancing and being silly. He said, "Oh my God, I wish she would sit on my lap and do that." I have disliked him ever since. It was a strange feeling to suddenly be disgusted by someone I thought I liked. My sister divorced him, thank goodness. I now have a strong aversion to men who violate the trust of young people. Story 39. We had twin daughters. He said to call him when they are 18. No, that is the creepiest thing I have ever heard. Story 40. Once at a family birthday party, my father-in-law told his 15-year-old daughter, "You are the most beautiful woman here." Story 41. This situation becomes serious quickly when hearing from abuse survivors. My mother told me as a teenager that I was too much of a prude, and therefore too immature to go on dates, because I reacted negatively when she insisted on showing me the proper technique for a handjob. This involved her covering her entire palm with saliva before using it on my thumb. My father made inappropriate jokes about me being disgusting to my mother and sister after he saw a bug crawl out from my rear. For context, we were forced to live in partial nudity on the kitchen floor, which is where we ate, lived, and slept. As the only adult making money and witnessing his half-naked preteen daughter living in squalor, his priority was to mock me instead of addressing the horrifying reality he allowed to persist. It's not that I had a bug-infested bottom. Rather, I was not wearing any pants due to my mother's rules, and a bug came up behind me, mistaking my rear for an exit. All of this fueled the narrative that I was the dirty one in the family. Personally, I wouldn't force a child to live in such conditions. Story 42. My uncle introduced me to a cousin I had never met before and reminded me several times that we were related, as if I should not consider pursuing her. The thought never crossed my mind, so I have no idea why he mentioned it. Story 43. There was a small room at the back of my grandparents' house that my cousins and I were all terrified of growing up and would refuse to sleep in. All the adults assured us it was fine and that we were being silly. When my extremely religious grandmother developed dementia, she kept talking about the things happening in that room and blessing herself. She refused to enter it and knew it was haunted. Story 44. Go back to sleep. There isn't anything under your bed. He's behind you now. I still haven't gotten over that and shiver at the memory. Story 45. After my twins passed away shortly after birth, my sister said, "It's a good thing they died when they did, so you didn't get too attached." Story 46. This happened when my youngest was about 3 years old. Twice, when getting her out of bed, she looked to one corner in her room, waved and said, "Bye." Story 47. When I was 14, my then 28-year-old uncle, who was my mother's much younger half-brother, told me, "If you weren't my niece, I'd date you." I cut contact with my uncle and never told anyone until 2 years ago when he was involved in the unexpected death of my beloved grandfather. I explained to everyone exactly why I stopped speaking to him, as they always wondered since we were very close when I was a child. It still makes me uncomfortable to this day, and I pray I never see him again. Story 48. My cousin has always been the outcast in the family. Unfortunately, he was constantly reminded of that while growing up. He confided in me that he had a dream where he harmed his parents and felt happiness when he did it. Story 49. When I was about 3, we had a cat that had stillborn kittens. I asked my father if we could make crosses for them, and he agreed. As he was making them, I asked, "Aren't those too small?" Dad replied, "What do you mean?" I said, "Aren't we going to nail them to them?" Dad, after a moment of silence, said, "We're not going to do that." I replied, "Oh." Story 50. I took care of my mother between the ages of 18 and 22. I was her sole caregiver. I realized she was finally succumbing to her long-term illness when my friend and I asked her if she would be okay for a couple of hours so I could go to the gym with him nearby. She said, "You're going to have to call your aunt." That aunt had long since passed away, and they never got along. Story 51. I had a cousin who completed 2 deployments to the Middle East and experienced severe post-traumatic stress disorder. During a family dinner, he casually stood up, walked to the front window, and looked outside. He returned a minute later and said nothing. After another minute, he remarked, "God, I miss killing the enemy. Don't worry." He has since found a great therapist and received effective help for his condition. Story 52. When we learned that my dad married his longtime secret mistress while still married to my mom, he told me I had no right to judge him and that all I care about is money. He even said he wished he could end his life so I could dance with the money on his grave. Story 53. My uncle, who is not actually my uncle, noticed I was feeling very uncomfortable when he was discussing inappropriate topics with my parents. I have post-traumatic stress disorder because I was sexually assaulted, and he laughed at me, saying it is not his fault that I'm a virgin. First of all, that is disgusting. Second of all, how would you know that? Naturally, my mom reprimanded me instead of him, but I am not surprised. I don't really talk to him anymore when he comes to visit. I just can't look at him the same way anymore. Story 54. My mom recently told me that when I was ill, if I died, her neighbors would bring her free meals for a couple of weeks. She genuinely thought that sounded exciting and like an outcome she was hoping for. Story 55. My youngest son was about 4 years old and playing by himself. After a bit, I realized he was talking to someone or pretending to. I asked him who he was playing with, and he said, "An old man." I asked him what the old man's name was and what he was doing, and he said, "Grandpa, and he's walking with his cane." My kids call my dad Papa. So it was strange to me, and my husband's father is called Papa Laundry. I asked him who Grandpa was and what he looked like. My son replied, "My grandpa, he has a red shirt and brown pants." Creeped me out, but I didn't think too much about it. I posted about the interaction on my social media page, and my grandmother shared a picture of my great-grandfather, whom I never met, in an old family photo wearing a red shirt and brown pants. He had a prosthetic leg from the war, so he walked with a cane. I had never seen that photo before, and my son certainly never had either. My family is convinced he was visiting to say hello. Still, it was the creepiest thing my child has ever said. Story 56. When my brother was little, around 3 years old, we were sitting outside on the porch in relative silence. The sun was setting, and as it got dark, he suddenly said in a super stoic voice, "Darkness comes." Story 57. My mom was cleaning something off the floor when my aunt's creepy husband said to my mom's husband, "That's the way you want them." On their knees and silent. It was an insane thing to say. He only became creepier towards me and my sister in the following years, until we put a stop to it and now refuse to be in the same room as him. He tried hitting on my sister for years after her breakup with her boyfriend and started hitting on me too after my breakup with my boyfriend. Story 58. I have a story to share. My mother passed away, and my maternal aunt adopted me. However, her husband, my uncle by marriage, expressed his fear that I would accuse him of molestation and didn't want me to live with them. I was never molested and had no prior history of false allegations. Years later, my best friend told me that the reason she stopped sleeping over was due to inappropriate touching and comments from him. Story 59. Not drinking anything with dinner. They would have dinner, and then, after dinner, someone would bring out a pitcher of water and glasses. They would sit around the table, drink their glasses of water without talking, put them down, and walk away. Story 60. No one will ever love you. I'm going to set fire to the house with us in it. If you tell anyone, social services will take you away and put you in a children's home where they will hurt you very badly. Drink the poison, kid. Story 61. I can't even read threads like this because it's all about sick family members saying inappropriate things to children. I feel terrible that families are like this. To change the mood, I will share a spooky story. One time, when my nephew was 3, he told me that a man with a burning head visits him at night. I thought it was something he saw on television, but he was adamant that this man comes into his room and tries to set him on fire so he will die. It freaked me out badly, even though I knew it was just his imagination. Story 62. I was going to mention the time my almost 2-year-old niece looked at me and yelled, "Scary," while pointing down a dark hallway when we were alone. But the other comments are much worse. Story 63. When I was a child, my family gathered with my closest aunt and cousins for a trip to the San Diego Zoo. We were split into 2 cars, with the boys in my aunt's Land Rover and the girls in my mother's station wagon. About halfway there, my aunt turned around to address us in the back seat. She asked my little sister, who was a 5-year-old angelic girl with curly platinum blonde hair and a peculiar affinity for ruffled dresses, what she wanted to be when she grew up. A witch doctor. The adults laughed awkwardly, and then my aunt asked, "Why?" "Because I want to kill things." The rest of the drive was silent. Story 64. When my uncle told me how old his girlfriend was when they started dating, he was nearly 30 and she was 15. Story 65. My dad's cousin gave me a slightly unsettling vibe the first time I met him while I was underage. When we visited again a few years later, when I was 20 and wearing a button-up denim skirt, he told me, "Loosen some buttons. I bet you're tired from your trip." He then continued to comment on my pictures for a while afterward. Story 66. I was in my 20s when my dad was watching my nieces and he punished them for being naughty. One of my nieces didn't cry from the punishment, and my dad asked, "Do you like that?" It really disturbed me. Story 67. After I had been working a couple of months waitressing as my first job, my dad asked me what I thought of the cooks who worked there. One cook in particular he pressed on about. I told him that at first I thought he was unusual and intimidating, but as time went on he kept seeking me out to tell me funny stories, and he was the only one who sat with me when we ate, so now we were friends. My dad conducted psychiatric evaluations on criminals. He also rarely showed emotion and believed in logic above all else. When I told him that this man had become my friend, he became very angry and told me, totally uncharacteristically, that I should trust my first impression of people. I found out years later about 2 women that he had assaulted. One was a woman walking home from work when he pulled her into the bushes and violently attacked her right there next to the sidewalk. Story 68. You'll never forget this day. Before my father took the life of a man in front of me and then knocked me into the dirt to claim self-defense against the other man for attacking his child. I certainly haven't, Dad. Story 69. My father said, "You look like your mother. Why weren't you born a woman?" He finished with a couple of jokes about changing me to replace her. I stayed with other family after that. He wouldn't have done anything that I know. Unfortunately, the jokes left me with bad sleep due to scary dreams. Story 70. Not so much creepy as it is horrible, but my father tried to kill my childhood dog when I was about 11 years old. He grabbed a hammer and went for him. Thank God my dog was small enough to hide far behind the couch where he couldn't reach him. My mother was able to talk him down eventually. I was utterly traumatized. I don't remember screaming louder or crying harder in my life. I loved my dog so much. The next day, my father tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. I never forgot that moment. He never apologized for it. It was a selfish act from an insecure man with extreme anger and misplaced aggression issues. I also never forgave him. When I reached adulthood, I cut ties almost completely. I don't know if he realized it was because of that day or simply because of the other 100 terrible things he did during my childhood, but he never really questioned why. My mother knew, though. He passed away last year. Now, whenever I think of my father, it's impossible not to think of that moment and similar moments. I really wish I could say I have a fond memory of my father. I really do. He had his moments. He worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. He made sure we had presents under the tree every Christmas. He took me fishing on the weekends. But that man tried to kill my dog with a hammer in front of me when I was 11. Among many other abusive things I won't mention. This is the part where I say I don't care that he's gone. When my mother asks if I miss him, I lie and say yes, because I know it makes her happy to hear. But I think she knows deep down that I don't, and I believe she understands exactly why. It's 100% deserved. Moral of the story: your children will remember the important moments. You choose what they are. Story 71. When I was about 15, my mom told me with casual exasperation what kind of sexual acts she had to perform with my stepfather to get him to agree to give her money for my birthday presents from Rite Aid. We were not wealthy by any means, but certainly not at the level of telling my daughter the type of favors I had to provide for a set of $10 foam curlers either. You can imagine there was a lot of other stuff, but the absurdity of the tone, statement, and entire situation is probably what came to mind first as the creepiest. Story 72. Not me, but my college friend's dad, upon finding out she has been spending some nights at her boyfriend's, told her in front of us, "I buy your underwear, and it's another guy taking them off you." Story 73. My dad is a builder and I am too. I walked into the local builder's merchant and spotted him at the counter. I approached him and overheard him saying to the clerk, "I'm looking for a 12-year-old. I would consider older but no older than 14. They were discussing a new horse he wanted to buy. Story 74. You will look really pretty with those braces off. I was 13 when my 22-year-old cousin said that to me. Story 75. Our family owns a madrasa, which is an Islamic school, and my father is the head of our school. It is still a fairly small school with a few classrooms, and Muslim students come in on Saturdays and Sundays. Most of the students are preteen to teenage girls, aged 15 and below. My father told them, "It is better if all of you are married very soon. We need more future Muslims in our community. I find it unsettling to tell young girls that they need to become pregnant very soon." Story 76. My grandpa said he would marry me if I weren't his granddaughter. He said this in front of my future husband during the weekend of our wedding. Story 77. My mom: "I'm so attracted to you right now. Do you want to fool around?" Also my mom: "There are ghosts in the attic and they hate your father. I think they want him dead." My mom again: "Your father thinks you're a demon succubus and that you are trying to seduce him. Maybe you should stop sitting on his lap." Also my mom: "While chasing me with a knife, why don't you just stab me to death? I wish you would so I can haunt you every day until you die." Somehow, I let her back into my life over and over again until finally, I was done this year. Having a child of my own made me realize that not only could I not forgive her, but I don't feel safe with her around him. She doesn't know what she did. Story 78. My older brother was an alcoholic. Around 10 years ago, we both found ourselves staying at my parents' house again, with bedrooms in the basement across the hall from each other. We were in our mid to late 20s at the time. It wasn't something he said, but late one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I could hear him inside his room making bizarre, scary growling and grunting noises. His door was closed and the light was off. He was just in there, in the dark, growling like a strange animal. It scared me so much that I grabbed my childhood teddy bear and went upstairs to sleep in the living room, just like I would if I were scared as a kid. I kind of laugh about it now, but in the moment it was really freaky. His disease took him 4 years ago. I miss my big brother a lot and mostly try to remember the good times. But this memory from one of the worst and weirdest times of our lives certainly stands out. Story 79. My grandfather approached me when I was about 5 years old and pulled my thumb, which I was sucking, out of my mouth. He sucked on it and said it tasted good, then walked away. I told my mother and she laughed. I never sucked my thumb again and later noticed as an adult that my grandmother never left me alone with him after that. Something happened at some point, and they knew about it but covered it up while still allowing young relatives to be around him. Rest in peace, Ed. May all the energy you contributed to the world during your life return to you tenfold wherever you are now. Story 80. My cousin married a man, making him a relative by marriage. There have been countless creepy incidents, but perhaps the worst was when he pulled my pants down while I was sleeping at the age of 15. Most recently, my cousin had children with him who are now grown. They are now divorced but still get along for the sake of the kids. My cousin is a twin, and her niece, who is also my cousin, was getting married. At the reception, my husband, father, siblings, and I were seated at a table with my cousin, her 2 grown children, and her ex-husband. My husband and I hadn't been married for quite a year, so this was the first time he was meeting most of these people, aside from an initial meet and greet at my wedding. My cousin's ex has always been a creep, and I cannot stand him. Neither can anyone in my family, and I don't understand why he needs to be at family functions. As we sat there enjoying our dinner, my cousin's ex started talking in detail about a time he was intimate with a woman. He provided a very graphic description. While my husband is well aware of what sex is, he is a respectable man and could not believe what he was hearing at the dinner table. He leaned into me, and I could tell he was getting upset. He asked, "Who is this guy?" I explained that it was my cousin's ex and the father of her children. My husband sat there for a moment trying to connect the dots. He leaned in and asked, "Wait, so that young girl is this man's daughter?" I replied, "Yes, he used to be married to her. But they're divorced now, and those are their 2 kids." My husband abruptly stood up, visibly shaken, and said, "Excuse me? You speak that way in front of your daughter?" Everyone went silent and looked over. I sarcastically remarked, "He talks that way in front of everyone." My husband tossed the napkin he was holding onto the table and declared, "Well, I've lost my appetite." He walked away to have a cigar with my uncle in the smoking section. Some of the older gentlemen gathered around and offered my husband a supportive gesture. My husband never sat down again the rest of the night, but I loved every moment of it. I had never seen anyone put him in his place like that. I had always wondered why the older males in my family remained silent around such a creep, especially since he was inappropriate all the time. I later found out he had been abusive to my cousin when they were together, so perhaps the elders were afraid of provoking him, fearing he might take it out on my cousin. I don't know, but I appreciated what my husband did. This man is short, overweight, pale, and bald, not intimidating at all. My husband, though small, is strong. If things had turned physical, he would have brought that man down quickly. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.